Hello and welcome to this month's Mytech U, where today we're going to be talking about questions you should be asking about backup and recovery. My name is Nathan Austin, and we have the privilege of having Philip Holt, who's the Mytech Solution Architect. Hello. Take us through backup and recovery. And the reason why we put this presentation together today is because there's thousands of backup solutions on the market. If you went out and did an internet search, you'd find backup and cloud storage and recovery. That is a very hot market. There are lots of different options and solutions out there. So we wanted to talk about not so much about all the different solutions that are out there, but what are the questions you should be asking about the different backup solutions and the recovery, and making sure that you've got the right business questions in mind so that you can make sure that whatever backup solution you choose, it's in alignment with your business and recovery defined objectives. So the other thing, before I hand it over to Philip, I wanted to make sure to touch on with everyone today is a couple concepts that get confused and sometimes get interchanged when you talk about backup and recovery is disaster recovery versus business continuity. So today we're going to be talking about backup and disaster recovery, which is really the ability to restore data and systems and access to those systems by your staff and or customers, by the people who need to use them. Whereas business continuity is typically more of an overarching, all-encompassing, how do you get your business back into operations, which could involve communication plans with your different staff, could involve facilities as far as what if you had a site outage, as well as just, for instance, some of our manufacturing customers that we work with have reciprocal agreements in place with other manufacturing facilities so that if their site was out, they had a site outage, they could actually resume production at another facility. So we're talking about the first component, which is just the backup and disaster recovery, which is very much a component of business continuity, but it is not we're not going to be touching on the much larger topic of business continuity today. So wanted to delineate that because oftentimes those words are interchanged and there's confusion there. So wanted to clarify that before we went on. So Philip, with that said, please take us through the questions we should be asking about backup and recovery.
Will do. Thanks for the great clarification on what we're talking about. We're talking about backup and disaster recovery. And a quick agenda just of the high-level topics and how this is broken out. We're going to talk about what is at risk. Then we're going to talk about getting some alphabet soup and talk about the TLAs, the three-letter acronyms that are associated with disaster recovery. A couple of those you may be familiar with, a couple of them may be new to you folks. Then we're going to talk about designing the solution, and then there's lots of different ways to do it. So again, we're going to be focusing on the questions that you should be considering when designing the solution and who needs to be involved. And we're going to talk a little bit about the hardware infrastructure that sometimes sits behind that, both as part of the recovery as also as the potential risked objects. And then clarifying a little bit about cloud and off-site, and we're going to talk about why you'd want that and what the differences are. And again, the agenda we're talking about here is focusing, for the most part, on questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're wading into this pretty deep topic. So starting out, what are we trying to protect? It seems like a pretty self-evident question, but when you start looking into it a little deeper, you realize it's more than just data and systems. We're talking about protecting the business, right? So the business or the institution, whether that's a for-profit or a non-profit or it's helping people or making stuff, that business is at risk in the event of a issue or event that may interrupt your IT systems. So that's just kind of a bigger end picture. These are some things we want to think about when we're doing this. And it's more than just the data. Sometimes this.
Philip, we just lost you. For some reason, I just lost you off of. You just went silent. So I'll pick up here until we get you back.
Great.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Sorry, I don't know what happened, but you just went radio silent on us there for a little bit.
I apologize. Am I back? Have I been recovered?
Yeah, you're good.
All right.
We recovered the system.
We recovered the system. It was a technology error, apparently. So, Nathan, why don't you cue us off this slide since you know where you guys last heard me, and then I'll
Yeah, so the key things that I want to talk about here is really these are the business conversations. Too often when people ask themselves about backups, they're thinking about the cost of the backup or and that's really where most people that I see focus on that. And instead, we really need to make sure that there's and oftentimes when IT people or people that aren't the decision makers or aren't necessarily the president or the owner or whoever needs to make the business decisions, sometimes aren't in the position to answer these questions and really understand what's really at risk here. And so this slide is really to make sure that allow us to think about the things that we really are trying to protect here at a business level and understand the impact of these component things. And one of the areas that I like to call out, even though it seems grandiose to say, well, what other things could be at risk? When I say lives could be at risk, well, I know of a couple different customers, definitely customers that we serve, where, for instance, one of them is a meat packing plant, and their data, if there's ever an FDA recall, if they don't have access and they can't recover data, there could be lives at risk as far as tracking down some foodborne illness. Medical institutions where data to be able to serve patients or get access so they can accurately serve patients, that could be time sensitive and life threatening if we don't have these kind of things in place. So that doesn't apply to everybody, but it's definitely something that applies to many different institutions depending on the industry you're in. But the other thing that I would like to call out here too is the military or trade secrets. We actually have several customers that are basically regulated by or work in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security because of some of the technology they produce, and making sure that there's certain requirements that they have too, and those are some of the things at risk when you're talking about being able to back up and recover this information as well. So it's more than just the cost of a backup. There are real business needs here, and making sure that we think about those. So sorry, Phil, just kind of took this slide, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this before you move on.
Yeah, no, I think we're just going to segue in and say, summarizing, what we're trying to protect is really a business and institutional issue, and the IT people who are often asked, how are you doing that, what do we do, are oftentimes appropriately have their head a little bit in the weeds in terms of databases and bytes and tapes and things like that. And so making sure that that line is well-defined, drawn out, is part of what we're going to do when we talk about our alphabet soup here we're coming up with. So RPO and RPC. So RPO is a term, if you spent some time in disaster planning, you've heard before, and that's recovery point objective. And I got a little definition there that I made up with the help of Wikipedia. But essentially, the recovery point objective is we want to define what is the maximum tolerable loss of data. And this could be differentiated by system, it could be differentiated by service, maybe, but it is the target, what is the worst case that we can accept. And when we look at that question, again, going back to the previous slide about what's at risk, this is an institutional decision. This is a management decision. This is someone needs to understand the various considerations of regulation and the various costs of what would be lost, or whether or not there are missions that have been committed to. But the recovery point objective is a defined maximum tolerable loss. And it's very often confused with the concept of an RPC, or a recovery point capability. And I sometimes get people tell me I'm going too deep into the weeds when I start trying to differentiate between RPO and RPC, but I think it's really critical to the conversation. I think it's something that needs to be fleshed out and clarified because it has to do with accountability as to who's responsible for each one. So the recovery point capability is, in fact, the actual interval that you can recover. So if there's a difference in between the maximum tolerable, or if the maximum tolerable is less than your capability, then you have real issues that need to be addressed. And the capability it's determined by the technology that you're running. Are you doing once-a-day backups, twice-a-day backups? Do you have continuous protection of various services? And we will talk about the last good backup, and people talk about your recovery point capability being greater than your recovery point objective, I would go as far as say your recovery point capability should probably be half as much as your recovery point objective because of that word in parentheses on the second line talking about your last good backup, right? We want to believe that all of our backups are good, and we're testing to make sure that's the case. But this is a point, again, to kick the issue a little harder. Recovery point objective is defined by the institution, and recovery point capability is the actual capability of the IT department. And moving on to the soup, I'm going to talk about recovery time objective and recovery time capability. So this is really referred to things on the other side of the event. We were talking about previously things you can do before a bad thing happens, and now we're talking about what do you do after the bad thing happens. And along a similar vein is the recovery time objective is the targeted duration, what is the expectation set for the maximum amount of time that you can be without services or access to your data. It doesn't necessarily talk about how old that data is, it just talks about how long are you not able to access it. And once again, this is defined by the institution, and the considerations are very similar to the last one. We have regulatory considerations. Certain financial institutions have obligations to be able to process transactions within a certain amount of time. And there's a cost of implementing the technology to make it happen. And there's also a cost of lost production, so that when you're down, everyone's sitting around twiddling their thumbs and checking on Facebook and not making the stuff that accomplishes what we need to accomplish. On the flip side of that, recovery time capability is, once again, this is the actual amount of time that's required to recover from a disaster. And once again, it's the responsibility of the IT department to execute this. One thing I like to talk about a little bit is when does that recovery start? For example, as an example, we may know that it takes 2 hours for us to restore a backup from our appliance. But if a service goes down and it takes us an hour to get to the office to kick off that process, then our recovery time capability is really 3 hours. It's the sum of the amount of time it takes us to, number one, declare that we're going to go into recovery mode, plus the amount of time it takes us to execute that. And that execution is not just clicking the button, but it's also getting to the place where you can click the button. And the other point about recovery time capability is that if I were part of the institutional management that was defining an RTO, I would certainly want to know that my RTC was tested and verified. So this is part of that, heard it before, right next to backup early and often is make sure you test your backups. So flip side to that conversation. Some people don't like text blobs, and so I put together this kind of quick little picture that might be helpful to clarify in a more graphical format what we're talking about. On the top half of the screen here, we're really talking about the RPO, or the recovery points. And so what you see here is you have the red indicates the event that occurs. An event could be a disaster. It could be a server going down. It could be an asteroid falling out of the heavens and crushing everything. But what we'll see is that we also over here, we have multiple recovery points. Hopefully you have multiple recovery points. And the recovery point objective ought to be larger than one or more of the recovery points. And that interval in between is defined as that recovery point capability. The red line here indicates the what's at risk question. So we talk about here we have data loss. And the amount of information that we believe will be lost occurs in between, for most systems, in between the last recovery point and the point at which it stops. The interruption occurs. Sometimes this line can actually extend further past the event. It depends on what sort of data we're talking about. So as an example, if we're just talking about transactions inside of a database, once the database is offline, we can assume that we wouldn't be able to change it after the event occurred, so there'd be no potential for further data loss. However, and a different example of a system is maybe an email. Right? So if we have a system where our email server goes down at 10 a.m. and we can recover from a backup at 8 a.m., there's also potential to lose data that would be coming in between when the data is lost and when we recover. So that would be moving us on to the second portion of this slide. Very similar thing, but you see it's on the other side of the event, right? So the recovery time objective is the expectation that we've been set for how long it's going to take us to bring our services back online. And the recovery time capability is our demonstrated ability to how long it takes to actually recover. And the primary the primary risk that we're looking at in between the event and the recovery time is production lost. There can also be data loss in some of the examples of services that continue outside of the institution that are reliant on your technology. But in general, when we're looking at these things, we talk about data loss, data lost for the recovery point, and production lost for the recovery time.
So Philip, this one, if I may just touch on this, because
sure.
I think one of the things that reason why we spend so much time on this is because we don't want, I've had too many conversations with business owners who didn't understand this until after they had to suffer some sort of an outage. And then they asked the question after they suffered a production loss and a data loss, how come it took so long to recover? How come I couldn't get up faster? How come I lost this data? So it's important to understand that the way, and understand these variables of the backup solution you choose and ask these questions to make sure that you can meet your requirements, because you don't want to find this out post an event. And this slide is really to just kind of give a couple illustrations of how conversations that I know we've had with other business owners and operators around, well, what are we really talking about as far as simple math you might be able to do to help understand the value of or the production loss potential is, relative to, like the windows of time that Philip was talking about here. In a $10 million organization, for instance, if you do that divided by the number of hours in a business day annually, that's around $5,000 an hour, and that's just hard cost. That doesn't necessarily, there's probably other soft costs, reputation costs that may be included in that, and obviously that scales up as the larger organization goes. And on the recovery point objective, as Philip said, around what's at risk is the data loss, and the data loss could be, and again, just using an example of if you had 50 people in your organization, 4 transactions per hour of some sort of data entry, that would be something where, that's just an estimate, but that's probably a low estimate actually. You could have 200 transactions an hour at risk if you don't have the, depending on your recovery point objective or your recovery point capability, as Phil talked about. So this was just kind of to summarize it, that this is what, again, I've had too many conversations with business owners and operators asking these questions after they suffer some sort of an outage as opposed to before. So go ahead, Philip, sorry.
That's a good point. And the other thing I want to point out is sometimes in recovery point objective, sometimes the answer is 0, that there is no acceptable tolerable loss. So that's a special case. Oftentimes in that case, it's very expensive to protect against that. It can be done, but that's basically done in redundancy. So this here talks about transactions per hour that can be potentially have a cost. But let's say you're a bank. It doesn't matter how long you're down. You need to get every single cash withdrawal needs to be noted, and the 0 loss is tolerable.
Yeah, great point.
So we're going to talk about designing the solution for recovery, and what does that look like? And we have this thing here, 3, 2, 1, that you'll see kind of scattered out, sprinkled throughout this our slide deck here. But the 3, 2, 1 really refers to, we want to be looking at 3 copies of our data in 2 different media types or 2 different data storages, and one of them should be off-site. So this includes your production data, but 3 copies of the data, 2 different media types, and one of them should be off-site. So looking at our critical and auxiliary business functions, after we've kind of we have an understanding of what RPO and RTO are all about, all services are not created equal. So inside of an organization, we have kind of, the core things that we have to do, and then we have ancillary things, or things that can wait, or things that can be delayed. And one of the exercises we need to go through is to identify in our organization what are those critical functions, and then what are their system dependencies. So some of the examples we have here is we have our electronic health record system, our customer relations systems, and we map those onto their dependencies. So in many cases here, like the EHR, it comes down to, is the server up or is the server down? But some of the other ones, like email or remote access functions, may be more correlated to, is the internet up or is the internet down? So looking at our critical business functions, looking at what services are critical and which services could potentially wait or should be recovered last, and mapping those to the dependencies that they have, and then making a, potentially in certain instances, there could be a different RPO and RTO for each individual system.
Yeah, Philip, and I would say one of the things that I like to note, especially considering our audience consists of organizations who might only have 1 to 3 servers or systems, and organizations that might have 10 or 20 different or more different systems. And so definitely as an organization adds more and more systems, the ability to and the associated cost with deploying a solution, it makes sense oftentimes to evaluate saying, well, and defining RPO and RTO by system, because it'll actually, the higher the, the faster you need to recover a system, the more expensive it's going to be to back up and recover it. So it makes sense to start creating a line and defining, what systems are we going to back up, as you mentioned. So, but for our smaller customers that only have 1, 2, or 3-ish, somewhere in that ballpark number of servers or systems, oftentimes there's not a whole lot of strong cost delineation for doing that. But definitely as you get larger and you have more systems and functions, critical versus ancillary functions, it makes sense to do it.
Yep, and I think that's one of the big things that comes up with talking about where the one is in the 3-2-1. What does our off-site portion of it look like? When the systems are very complex and there's lots of them, you might have multiple different types of off-site capabilities and requirements. But for most of the organizations that we work with, you're right, Nathan, the idea is simply let's replicate everything we have in our office and make sure we could turn it up somewhere else. And one of the ways we look at doing that is to use a cloud-based service. And those cloud-based services, there's a differentiating question of, we can back the data up, we can get the bits of the information or the database or the copies of the email into the cloud, but we have not recovered the service if we can't subsequently access that data in the cloud. So understanding what the difference there between the storage only and the ability to recover. And
yeah, I definitely appreciate those comments. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the section below on the cloud, but the key point you just mentioned is that there's different capabilities, and that gets back to your capability part of this whole conversation, which is, not all solutions are created equal, and not all offsite storage is created equal, and sometimes it's just the raw storage, and sometimes you can actually choose solutions where you can recover to a production environment in the cloud, and making sure that that's part of your considerations, again, whether you're doing it replicating to a secondary site and those capabilities exist, or if you're replicating to a hosted solution and whether or not those capabilities exist.
Yeah. So on this slide, we have kind of different words for that kind of outline the same issues we had in the previous slide, but this is really kind of in the question format, and we've also provided some kind of sample answers. So common recovery timeframes, for example, we generally measure in hours. And the point on the cloud, the secondary site or cloud infrastructure, oftentimes it comes down to cost and capability. So cost is a big one. And another point here is that when that asteroid strikes and destroys your building, is it going to bounce and hit the building across town as well? So the geographic distance sometimes between different sites is important.
Sometimes in the Midwest, Mytech operates in Minnesota and in Colorado. In the Midwest, there's oftentimes those kind of incidences might be, ice storms, or we're not so much affected by, the Katrinas of the world or earthquakes and things like that. But so that's oftentimes less of a consideration. But the point is that as a business, you should define what your tolerance for risk is. And if you have a secondary site, and if that secondary site's only 2 blocks away, and that's not enough of a tolerance for you to mitigate the risk you're trying to mitigate as an organization, then you need to consider some other offsite mechanism. So I think that's really the key, is making sure that whatever that is, that it meets your requirement and whatever risk you're trying to mitigate as an organization.
Yeah, and on the third part of this question, in addition to we're talking about unique backup or archiving retention requirements, there may be regulations that define how often you need to back up or how quickly you need to be able to restore. Also, within certain industries, there may be limits on what geographic areas can you keep copies of that data, right? So if you're HIPAA regulated, you need to keep this stuff inside the US of A if you're operating in the US of A. And certainly financial institutions, some other regulatory agencies require the geolocation of data to be known and defined as well. So just a call out here that as we asked ourselves earlier about what our RPO and RTO, and we talked about how that was the management decision, the institutional decision, we mentioned one of the considerations then was also any regulatory requirements as well.
The other point that I'd like to mention here, Philip, as far as a question, that oftentimes different solutions, when you're talking about archiving and retention, the local, again, the 3-2-1, right? So you got the production copy, and then you have your backup copy. Typically, that backup, the first backup copy is on-premise, some at one of your facilities or maybe at the data center you're working with. And oftentimes that is, at least for many of the solutions that Mytech works with and in our industry, the retention on the local appliance or local device or the local backup is oftentimes shrunk down to maybe a 60-day window, for example. But the offsite component we can retain for years and years, right, to meet, for instance, some of these medical or financial requirements as far as retaining data for 7 or 10 years. So there's also some considerations there as far as understanding that about your backup, and make sure you ask those questions relative to what your requirements are.
Yeah, and if I was being a real picky jerk, I would tell people that archiving is not a backup. Oftentimes the same systems, right? We're using the same software and the same programs, some of the same capabilities to meet our backup and disaster requirement needs, but they are, can also, with a different way of thinking about, be separated out as an entirely different service. So yes, there's a blend on those two, but the reason I call that out is that if you're archiving requirements for financial data, 7 years of tax returns or something like that, it's perfectly appropriate, in fact, not uncommon, to have a different system or a different infrastructure to do that archival portion. Because there's less change, and we really don't talk about recovery points when we're talking about archiving. Sometimes archiving, it's a matter of just making a single one-time copy of the data off-site every year, and then you've met that requirement as well. So that's a good point. As we're asking ourselves about these physical cloud geolocation, why are we asking those questions? We're asking those questions because in the end, it comes down to what is the nature of the disaster we're dealing with. And disasters come in lots of different shapes and sizes, right? When we have these conversations about where the disaster, the event, we oftentimes use hyperbole like asteroids and things like this. But in the real world, the much more likely scenarios have potentially a lower total consequence, but they're much more frequent. And that would be something like a physical failure of a single server, right? So maybe not all your servers are out, or maybe the internet goes out, but it's going to come back online. So understanding what are the redundancies we can do to put in place for the best case scenario of a disruptive event is that we avoid it, right? So up until now in this conversation, we've been talking about the, when the event happens, how much do we lose, and how long does it take us to get it back on? But investing in a good UPS, uninterruptible power supply, could in fact prevent the power outage from becoming a disaster. So we want to make sure when we're building our infrastructure that we take those into account as well. And taking advantage on our off-site location, we talked a little bit earlier about the, if you have two sites and you have two sets of infrastructure, can you leverage one to be the backup for the other? Can you have services spooled up? Do we talk about hot spares and cold spares and some systems like that, understanding whether or not we can take advantage of the fact that we already have a multi-geographic presence.
And on that point, Philip, I think that's where, there's a real cost, risk, reward conversation at a business level. And so having those conversations and understanding it might not make sense based on the risk you're trying to mitigate to have a fully redundant infrastructure. That's most organizations that we work with, that's not the case, right? They're not going to buy double what they need just because to mitigate against this potential risk. So it's definitely an assessment of what makes sense, what are the specific systems that we're really trying to recover, and understand the whether, again, single or multi-site options, and how do we mitigate against, like you mentioned, I really appreciate the way you mentioned that, the most common things that we can oftentimes avoid by investing prudently, as well as understanding the more likely scenarios that could impact your organization and mitigating those, as opposed to every single scenario that could possibly ever exist, like an asteroid, for example. So anyway, I appreciate you mentioning that the common outage piece. Yeah,
and so kind of moving on, we're talking about this multi-site thing a little bit. The other thing I just want to throw in there to point out is that sometimes those solutions may result in using different sets of technologies. So the type of backup or the granularity of the backup, or if you get into the weeds of incremental versus reverse incremental snapshotting and things like this, whether or not you're using multiple sites or whether or not you're using cloud can make a difference in terms of what may put some additional criteria on what your options are to define your RPO and RTO. And at the end, this is kind of a dope moment that's been proven in real life. You'd think people would think this, but we want to just call it out. Nathan and I have both experienced this with our customers. If a server blows up and we need to get it fixed, if the time that the manufacturer of the equipment has defined as how quickly they can get it fixed, if that time is larger than the amount of time you've said you can be down, the management is not setting up their IT department for success. And the IT department is not setting themselves up to meet management goals. So we oftentimes have conversations with customers, do I need a warranty? Why do I need a warranty? And really, this is why, because the ability of the warranty allows you to make that commitment to saying, I can get your services back online in X. And so just wanted to tie that conversation in and make sure that folks have clear in their head that the idea of a warranty, when we talk about with servers and storage, oftentimes has less to do with cost. We're not trying to buy insurance to keep the thing up and running. We're talking about how quickly can we recover it. So just to point on that, I don't know if you had anything else to add to that, Nathan.
Yeah, the only thing, we learn through pain, and part of our job for our customers is to help you avoid pain. And so this is something that, having a 4-hour response time on warranty is more expensive than a next business day response time. However, the impact of that can be very significant. And I'll give you a practical example of a customer that, opted for the next business day warranty years ago. This is about 4 or 5 years ago, and they encountered a physical outage event. It was a failed drive. At least that's the way it was presenting at first. So which caused their server to come down. We actually initiated a warranty next business day, got the drive the next business day, found out that there was actually another item that was bad that wasn't presenting itself because the primary the primary failure was being presented as a failed drive, and so we actually had to initiate yet another warranty, which again, guess what? Took the next business day to get done. So we actually turned what could have been if it was a 4-hour recovery, we could have had them up and running by the next morning probably, or early that next day. It ended up being a 3-day outage because of just having a next business day warranty versus a 4 business hour warranty or a 4-hour warranty. So most scenarios is a single piece of equipment, and it's right. But just kind of like what Philip was saying, you want to be able to mitigate against that risk because most recovery scenarios rely on physical infrastructure being back in functional for you to be able to get back in production as an organization. So please consider having a good warranty on your equipment because it'll help us deliver a recovery for you if we ever have to.
Yeah, I got just a couple more points to add to that because this is important. This is also part of why if stuff can't be warrantied, if it's out of warranty, if it's too old, do you really want that to be part of a institution where you have to go back and say, I cannot tell you what the recovery time objective is for this solution?
That's a great point.
Just another tying into the conversation we had earlier, I gave an example of your recovery time includes not only the amount of time that occurs after you click the recover button on your backups recovery software, but it also includes the amount of time it takes to drive to the office to click that button. The warranty also, in general, is the amount of time you have to add to your recovery time objective, right? You have a server that goes down and you have a 4-hour response time. That does not mean that your recovery will be up in 4 hours. If there, in fact, was a data loss event, it may be 4 hours before you can even think about beginning the restoration. So it's an additive thing as we look at this.
That's a great point as well.
So all these different scenarios we can look at, right? We've talked about the disasters that can exist or do exist. And if one were doing the full disaster recovery planning, and when you get into business continuity, you have to kind of flesh some of this stuff out. But we would look at the services, the dependencies, and the disasters we're trying to protect, and we create this big 3-dimensional matrix, and it's very big and very complicated. So the good news is that it turns out that almost all of the various risk scenarios that you would have to look at can essentially be boiled down to 2. And if you protect against these 2 events, then you can essentially presume that you can protect against all the others. And that is if the local equipment is lost or brought offline, and or a given service inside of the location is brought offline. And then the other scenario to consider is what happens if the building vanishes in a Schrodinger cloud, right? So neither of those are likely to happen, but if you plan for those 2, essentially you're going to have a good answer for all the other possible risks or disasters that could occur. We've given some example here of what some of those might look like in a more real-world concept. But again, the 2 outages you want to look at are partial outage at the local site, and then the complete vanishing primary site. What is the offsite? When we're a tester offsite. The second portion of it is that the data, recovering the data only or production in our cloud or at our offsite facility. The short answer, in general, most people would say, well, I always want to be able to be full production if I can. And so why are we asking this question? The big thing that oftentimes goes down to cost, is that just getting a copy of the bits off-site is pretty easy to do and pretty cheap to do. It will meet my recovery point objectives pretty easily and pretty cheaply. But the recovery time objective can get very long in the tooth if I am waiting to download all that data, or I have to recreate individual systems in order before I can start accessing and using the data or services. So we look at the full production in the cloud, and what does that look like? Sometimes it is sufficient to simply say, I'm going to replicate the 12 servers I have in my local environment, and I'm going to put a copy of those off to the cloud, and I'll be able to just turn them on in the cloud or start playing virtual machines or something like that, and maybe that will give us the access we need. But maybe it won't. Maybe there are maybe there are no workstations when my building blows up. So do I need to talk about putting in a terminal server, for example? Maybe my local environment doesn't have a terminal server because I don't need it because everyone's in the local office. But maybe I need to have one in production or standby in my cloud backup, because when I lose the building, I lose all the PCs, so I need a way to connect to that. So some considerations there about when we're talking about that 3, 2, 1, and the last one, the off-site portion. The recovering the data is going to protect that, is going to be associated with our RPO, and the production service availability is going to be associated with our RTO, or our recovery times. Other things we wanted to bring to attention is that when we start sending stuff off-site, we need to have the bandwidth to do that. So a lot of internet pipes are asymmetrical. They download faster than they upload. And when we're dealing with making backups to the cloud, we're talking about that upload speed, the opposite direction we normally push data. So having an understanding of what your circuits look like and what data is available and when you can use that needs to be considered. And the primary reason here, there's two real reasons. One is that it can affect, you can saturate that pipe pretty quickly, and then the consequence is that your actual normal non-disaster time experience on the network is poor. And the second major portion is that if your pipe isn't fast enough and you can't get the data off-site before the next snapshot or backup or recovery point is created, you can end up with no recovery points. So you have to be able to get that data off-site quickly enough that it's usable.
Philip, another point on that is in the recovery scenario. So for instance, not just at the primary site when you're just trying to get the data off-site and being able to run in production while you're also sending data off-site for just normal production and backup requirements. But if you have a secondary site and you plan on recovering to that site, does that site have enough bandwidth not only to receive the data, but then also to run in production? If you end up moving people over there and there's an increase in bandwidth utilization because you have more people over there because you're running in a recovery mode, does that secondary site have that? Or if those production systems that are at your main site and now are no longer at your main site because we've recovered to the cloud, does that site have enough bandwidth for you to run in production but now accessing systems that are across the internet versus on the local network? So bandwidth is definitely a strong variable, and it can have a major impact. And so understanding that and weighing the cost of the bandwidth and adding bandwidth or having the appropriate bandwidth to accommodate the requirements you have is important. It's very, very important.
That's very important. And also just the idea of the different technologies may have different capabilities. So if you may be fixed with a DSL or with a cable modem, but some of your MPLS pipes or things like that, your ISP may provide you with a burstable mode, right? So if you need to increase your bandwidth, how long does it take to do that? And then just another plug here for the things I always say about having redundant internet connections. We should always be doing that outside of our disaster recovery, but redundant internet connections make a play here as well, because one of the possible outage scenarios is loss of internet access. And again, we talked about the best way to not have to test your disaster recovery plans is to avoid having one. So redundant internet connections will help with that, like the UPS or the RAID disks. And also it can apply here with that offloading data set as well. We have a lot of organizations where we use the secondary internet connection, which would normally be kind of standing in a standby mode. We'll actually use that pipe to push the data off-site so that the local users aren't being impacted in normal everyday environment. Security of the data. Just to wrap up with this, when you're going to your off-site and you're understanding, we've talked about how we're going to decide, is that going to be multi-site? Is that going to be another branch office that I have? Is it going to be a cloud provider? Once again, understanding the both regulatory compliance and guarantees that the various folks can give us regarding what is the protection at the auxiliary site, whether it be in the cloud or not, and then also how is that data protected while it's what we call in flight. So when it's being transferred via your internet connections off to the cloud, how is that data protected? Is it encrypted? What are the encryption mechanisms that are used? Who has the keys? How do we make sure that we're not accidentally leaking all that data to the people who shouldn't have it when we're trying to get it off-site. So good news is there's some really good, simple solutions for that, but we just need to make sure we're checking the box and understanding what it is.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. That pretty much wraps up our presentation. Again, just to summarize, the reason why we've phrased this, the questions to ask about backup and recovery, is that there's too many times we've had conversations where we're just looking at the cost of a backup, or there's so many different solutions are out there. You do a search and there's thousands of options, but picking ones that actually are in alignment with your business requirements is a whole nother conversation, and we encourage you to have that conversation if you're working with Mytech, to have it with your team at Mytech. If you work with anybody else, or if you're trying to put one in place on your own, ask these questions of the solution. Make sure you can check those boxes, as Philip said. And really, backup is one of those frustrating parts of technology that has zero return on investment until the day you have to use it, right? So this is not an ROI conversation. This is the mitigation of risk conversation, and I hope you never have to use a backup for recovery, but the reason why they exist is because this stuff happens, and you need to protect yourself against it. So again, the whole reason why you have a backup is not to have a backup, it's so that you can recover. So with that said, thank you very much, Philip, for taking us through all the different scenarios and the questions we should be asking, and I want to thank everyone for participating. This will be recorded and available online within 24 hours, so if there's anyone else who could receive value out of this, by all means, you can forward that off to them, or you can contact us for further questions offline. Thank you very much. Philip, any final comments?
I'm just going to comment that it's way better to be asking the questions about backup recovery than explaining why you weren't able to. So ask before you have to explain, I guess.
That's a great point. So, all right, thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.